Hello, I'm Moishe. I'm here to talk about 25 things, or more or less, that I learned in more or less 250 interviews that I conducted at Google. So let me just introduce myself real quick. I've been at Etsy for about 4 months now. Before that, I was at Google for about 7 years. Before that, I was at Microsoft, and then some random startup, and then Microsoft again, and then a small time and billing company in Massachusetts. It actually occurred to me when I was writing up 25 things I've learned about interviewing that I've actually been in the software industry for 25 years now, which blows my mind and makes me feel kind of old. In terms of my experience interviewing, which is what I'm going to talk about, while I was at Google, I did about 250 interviews as the interviewer. I was on hiring committee, so a little bit of background about how Google's hiring process works if you don't know. Basically, there's a slate of interviewers, just like here at Etsy, like 4 or 5 on-site interviewers. Each interviewer writes up written feedback. That gets collated into a packet, which is sent to a committee of people who review the packet and make a hire or no hire decision. The people in that committee generally are not on the slate of interviewers who talk to the candidate in person. So it's an interesting process. I'll talk more about it. But anyway, I was on that hiring committee for 6 years of the 7 I was there. And I also taught interview training at Google for also about 6 years. I'm on the seller economics team here at Etsy. I joined that team largely because it was a chance to learn a bunch of stuff I didn't know and be surrounded by people who were experts at that. And it's a blast, so I'm learning a lot of math, a lot of stats, distributed computing stuff, Hadoop, et cetera. And one other thing to note about me, at all these places I kind of came on as a non-traditional hire. I didn't graduate college. My GPA for the 1 semester I was at college was about 2.1. So every place I interviewed at, I was nervous going in because my resume was conspicuously lacking something. Let me start out just by talking about some general stuff about interviewing that's not, I don't think, specific to technical interviews. It's I think, germane no matter what role you're interviewing for. So first off, it's fun. This is something that I never would have thought of before I started interviewing, being on the interviewer's side. But it turns out talking to people is fun, and meeting new people is extremely fun. And sharing expertise with somebody else who also has knowledge of the things that you're sharing expertise about is incredibly fun. I had an interview last summer with this woman who was a fairly recent college grad, had been working, I'm not sure where, but it's some maybe not super fun job. She was interviewing at Google, and I asked her my favorite interview question, which is find all the words on a boggle board, and I can talk about that more in depth too. But it turns out that question has these kind of 2 parallel routes to a solution. And you solve it one way, and then you solve it another way, and the 2 kind of converge into this very beautiful solution. And she got the first part, and she got the second part with a few hints, and then with a little more nudging, you could just see in her eyes these 2 things coming together into this like gleaming, beautiful like point. And she like literally said, "Oh my God, that's order 1. That's what everybody wants," and just like freaked out, right? And it's like it was so much fun. So that's part of it. Like that, you get that personal connection. Also, I basically got my computer science education being on a hiring committee and seeing all these algorithms that people use to test during interviews, right? So you learn a lot, and I think that's true no matter whether you're a college dropout or a PhD. Like there's always stuff you're going to learn by interviewing, whether it's technical stuff, whether it's personal relation type stuff, how to interact with people, and so on. Also, you just meet interesting people. One of the people I interviewed at Google, not for a developer role, but just something outside that scope, was Philip Zimmerman, who wrote PGP, so that was fun. So there's like these random things happen to you as when you put yourself out there and talk to people. So it's super fun, except when it isn't, and that happens too. It's a big time sink. Typically I think the time I'd set aside to do a 1-hour interview at Google was about 3 hours or so, like in terms of preparing for it, doing the actual interview, and then writing up feedback after, and then various like follow-up stuff. It's stressful, both for the interviewer and for the candidate. you're meeting a stranger, and I think for a lot of, it's safe to say for a lot of computer science people, meeting strangers is not our core competency. So there's some stress involved in that. There can be, like, random things can go sideways during an interview, right? Like, you get communications problems. You can't understand what the candidate's saying, or they can't understand what you're saying. That's tough. I've had candidates cry out of frustration, or like they just can't solve the problem. They don't know how to get traction on it, and that's rough. And that happens. It's rare, but it does happen. You can get guys who are just jerks. I think in my 250 at Google that happened one time, but it was not fun. He just had a chip on his shoulder, and yeah. Or people who just refuse to write code, like they're interviewing for a more senior position, and they just think it's below them to actually write code on the whiteboard or write code on a computer or whatever. Interviewing is also noisy, inaccurate, and arbitrary. I think this is like maybe the biggest thing I learned at Google. You get noise introduced by the process and the candidate's experience around that process, right? So the typical thing at Google was writing code on a whiteboard. If you've never written code on a whiteboard, writing code on a whiteboard is completely, it's difficult to do. You're used to thinking in Emacs or Vim or Eclipse or whatever, and you're used to autocomplete, and you're used to being able to look stuff up in Google when you can't find it and so on. And all of a sudden, you've just got this blank slate, and you got to write code. And not only that, you're getting whiteboard marker all over your sleeves because you can't find the eraser to erase it. And it's just like this kind of cascading problem that can be very hard. It's also noisy because the interviewer might be having a bad day, right? You don't like, I don't know, you didn't eat lunch that day, or you didn't have breakfast, or you got in a fight with your girlfriend that morning, or whatever, right? Like there's all these external things that can influence how you feel about interacting with a person. Because of this noise on both sides, you could interview the same candidate twice with the same set of interviewers and get a different result both times. And in fact, that was, is that a dog? That's awesome. So at Google, they were fairly generous about if you were borderline, they'd invite you back in a year or a year and a half to re-interview. It's not totally fair, but at least there was the kind of recognition of that. I don't know if you guys know who Steve Yegi is. He's this kind of logoriac blogger. He will drink a bottle of wine and write a 50-page blog post about whatever. So I shared an office with him, and he had this great example, or this great idea that every viable candidate for Google had a perfect slate of interviewers and a perfect anti-slate of interviewers. That is to say, anybody who'd actually been hired at Google, you could easily find 5 people who could interview that person and say no, right? It was trivial and well known. So that introduces this kind of arbitrariness to it. Part of the reason for that is the error bars for an interviewer are very large, right? Like, you're not getting perfect data about a candidate. You don't know, like, if this interviewer says yes or no, that definitely means yes or no. So Google's response to this was basically to set the bar very high, because the idea was missing somebody who was good was okay compared to hiring somebody who was bad, right? Like a false positive is much worse than a false negative. So because of that, that introduces extra arbitrariness. One story about that, when I was on hiring committee in Kirkland, this was probably 2007, we had a reputation as being kind of one of the harder hiring committees for packets to get through. So one week we got like our typical 8 or 10 packets of candidates, and coincidentally there's 8 or 10 people on hiring committee. We said no to every single one of these packets. And at the end of hiring committee, the recruiter was like, well, guess what, guys? These were your packets from when you were interviewed here, and you just decided not to hire any of yourselves. So it was a reality check, and like some things changed after that, but the fact remains that there is this like very kind of roll of the dice aspect to it. Another thing is data is a blessing and a curse. We collected a fair amount of data about interviewing. I'm sure you all saw the New York Times article where Laszlo said they tried to find a correlation between interviews and perf scores, and there was no correlation at all. So that's not surprising for reasons I'll talk about in a second. So just a little bit of background. So when you interview at Google, each interviewer gives a score to the candidate between 1 and 4. 1 means, please don't hire this person. 4 means, definitely hire this person. Those scores are very rare. It's kind of an exponential curve, so they tend to cluster around the 2.0 range and the 3.0 range. Because of that clustering, you have a very narrow range of actual meaningful scores to try to draw a correlation with. So anyway, the other thing about those scores is they're meaningless in isolation. Like a 3.1 that I gave was not the same as a 3.1 that this guy Michael Noth, who was on a hiring committee and was known for very, very difficult interviews, gave. So you try to draw these correlations between scores that mean different things to different people, and it's impossible. So you have all this data around, and you're tempted to use it in these, kind of, you're tempted to use it, and the fact is the numbers themselves are not meaningful. The one good thing about the scores was it at least let you build a histogram, so when you were in hiring committee, you could look at previous scores that interviewers gave and try to use that to predict, but it also was nice because it showed you how non-predictive the scores actually were, because the bars in the histogram were colored based on whether candidates got hired based on a given score, and for almost every interviewer there, they were all over the map. The real piece that hiring committee used, and the important piece, was the written feedback, right? So the score was there, but typically it was also followed with about 3 or 4 pages of written narrative about the candidate. So I think the upshot of that is it's very hard to put a number on things that matter about a candidate. Basically, putting a number on a person, right, is the same as IQ, is the same as SAT scores. It's like the classic mismeasure of man conundrum, right? Like you've got this cloud of data that you're looking at, and you're trying to project that into one dimension, and it basically doesn't work. Even worse than that is you can't even directly ask about stuff that matters, right? Like think about things that make a great employee. Think about things about somebody who you love to work with, right? You can't straight up ask. So I think about Bob Day, who's this guy I worked with at Google. He was basically my mentor when I started. He got me, let me hit the ground running and do stuff. My second week there, I was adding something to this code, this task management thing for the Windows download talk client, and just kind of had to glom something into this sort of kludgy thing. So I sent a code review to Bob, and Bob was like, how long do you think it would take to just rewrite this? And I was like, maybe 2 weeks. He's like, go rewrite it. Just go do it. And for me, where I was right then, that was the perfect thing to say. It was like exactly what I wanted to hear as Bob's coworker. It let me know that Bob trusted me. It let me know that there were things that were more important than just checking in immediately, like number of check-ins per week or whatever. It was about making an environment, like the code, like a good place to be. So how do you put a number on that? And how would you test for that in an interview, right? Even if you're going to describe that narratively, how could you possibly test for that in an interview? I think the best thing you can do is give people questions that exercise their creative ability, their enthusiasm, maybe their sense of fun. I'm pretty sure another great quality of Bob was he just loved to hack, right? This guy, he actually took a year off from Microsoft and hacked EverQuest. Rewrote the Windows drivers so he could extract data and display it on his screen about what his client was sending to the servers, all this crazy stuff. He was just that kind of guy. And I'm pretty sure if I asked him one of my favorite interview questions in an interview, he would have lit up and he would have been excited about it. And he's extremely smart. He would have got the right answer too, but that's almost a side effect of watching how somebody interacts with interesting problems. I think the key point that I want to say about this is I feel like interviewing is more like literary criticism than it is like statistics, right? You have this kind of big amorphous blob of data and you're trying to distill that. but you can't distill it into numbers. It only works to distill it into ideas. So another thing, interviewing is a team effort. I think Google did this pretty well in terms of getting a collection of interviewers from disparate teams with different skill sets and stuff to test candidates. You might have one interviewer who goes very deep with a candidate along one vector, but misses stuff in others, right? Like you might have two personalities that click very well, and then another personality just doesn't, and they start grading on each other, and that's something you would have missed with only one interviewer. Beyond that, isolation hurts, and what I mean by this is, so at Microsoft, the way that hiring worked was you had a slate of interviewers, just like Google, but you had one hiring manager who was responsible for saying yes or no. And what happened was certain teams were desperate to hire for two reasons. One is like you've got headcount and you want to fill it because you've got some emergency project coming up and you think that the more people you have helping out, the better. The second reason is your status as a manager is tied to how many reports you have. So if you have open headcount, you want to jump on it and fill it as soon as possible before it just magically goes away. So the problem is you've got one point of failure, which is the hiring manager. And they might hire just slightly below the bar, right? They're not being malicious. They're not like actively trying to sabotage anything. It's just they need to hire somebody right now. So the bar goes down a little bit. Then the person who just got hired goes on to interview, and then eventually goes on to be a hiring manager. And the bar goes down a little more, maybe for worse reasons. And then that keeps happening pretty quickly. Like the speed at which this happens is like, it's fairly fast. And there's no check on it because it's basically island evolution, right? Like there's no externalities coming in and damping this down. So one thing that Google did was the hiring committees were across teams. And there were managers in the hiring committee, but they didn't make a decision. The committee itself had to reach consensus. And there were multiple tiers of hiring committees. So like the Kirkland hiring committee would send their packets up to executive review. And while I was there, I think Larry was still signing off on every packet, which is insane. But the idea is that you have, when you hire an engineer there, you're hiring them for Google. So that has nice, it's not like you're hiring them for this team. And you don't get teams who have reputations as being like where the bars slipped a little bit and you don't want to take code from them. You've got something fairly consistent across the company. That was changing when I left, partly because of specialization. Like you want people who are like, you know, deep GPU nerds to work on Chrome or whatever. But yeah. So another thing, kind of stepping back a little bit. When you're interviewing, be prepared. You'd think that would go without saying, but the first time I was an interviewer at Microsoft, I basically found out that morning that I was on an interview loop. And it was with this guy, Daryl Richman, who'd been at Microsoft since like 1985, wrote like core pieces of something. Anyway, the guy like was very, very smart and been around a while. And he was interviewing to be on the team that I was on. And I had no idea what I was doing, right? Like my sum total of experience with interviewing was going through the Microsoft interview loop a couple of years before. So basically, he came into my office and I was like, I don't know, tell me about what you do. And he spent like 45 minutes telling me about his current job, and I got basically no data out of it. I sent my feedback off, and my manager, in classic Microsoft style, forwarded my feedback to the entire team and said, don't do this. So I contrast that with when I got to Google, they actually had interview training classes, which gave you some structure. It's like a 4 or 5 hour class. I don't even think that much is necessary, but just like sitting down with somebody who's done an interview before and walking through how it should work and what you're looking for, and just having a basic outline. You're gonna spend the first 10 minutes doing introduction, you're gonna spend about 40 minutes actually working on a technical problem or whatever problem you want to, and then 10 minutes of wrap up, Q&A, whatever. Just having that as a structure would have helped. But even beyond that, practicing, like just getting up at a whiteboard with your coworker and trying out technical questions, or like sitting down at a computer and trying them out, like however you want to do the questions, do a dry run like 3 or 4 times beforehand. It'll help you. And for me, like the first interviews I did, I think I was more nervous as the interviewer than I was as a candidate when I was interviewing to actually try to get a job, because there is a lot of pressure on you, right? You're expected to know everything about or you expect yourself to know everything about the question and so on. So yeah, so be prepared. But it's like jazz, right? Like unexpected things are gonna happen, shit's gonna go sideways, whatever. Part of being prepared is just knowing that that's gonna happen and make it work anyway, right? Like it's quite possible you're gonna ask your favorite interview question to somebody and they've already heard it. And maybe they'll tell you that, which is nice, or maybe they won't, but it'll become pretty obvious pretty quick. In that case, you've got to have some backup, or go even deeper with them on it and improvise. You may have somebody who just doesn't want to write code on the whiteboard, right? Like, or doesn't want to write code at all for whatever reason. Yeah, improvise with that. You might have somebody who starts going down a path for your favorite question that you've never gone down before and is actually discovering some cool stuff, which is the best feeling in the world. And be ready for that, and be prepared to be taught by people you're interviewing. That's kind of the best case scenario. And make mistakes, right? Like everything else at Etsy, I think iteration is key. You're like, when somebody first starts interviewing, they're gonna be bad at it. It's just like anything else, it takes practice. One thing they did at Google that I think was very helpful is they explicitly set up interview slates with more and less experienced interviewers on them, so you'd have like 3 calibrated interviewers, which was basically people who'd done more than 25, and then a couple of newbies. And the idea was that the newbies could totally screw up, and we just throw out all that data, and we'd still have enough to make a decision. And that happened occasionally, but you know, you got to start someplace, and without having that pool of people coming in, you eventually run out of experienced people. The only mistake that I would caution against, the only rule is don't be a dick, right? Like I think that's, other than that, whatever, but just be cool. And on that, every interview is a conversation, right? It's not ultimately a test or a gauntlet to run or something you're trying to put the candidate through to see if they can survive. You're having a conversation with a candidate, and the conversations can have goals, and that's okay. But you're not trying to stress the candidate out. You're not the tester and the candidate's like trying to get past you or something like that. You're talking to them. You're both humans. Act like it, right? So the primary goal of this conversation you're having with the candidate is make them happy, right? That overrides everything else. Like if you risk upsetting a candidate to try to get good data out of them, for whatever that means, in my opinion, you're doing something wrong. Actually, yeah, let me try this experiment. Raise your hand if you have a positive impression of the Google interview process, or if you had one coming in here. Yeah, so half a hand, 1.5 hands. And what's insane is this was Google's primary goal too, right? Like it's, so it's not like Google wasn't thinking about this, but you get one person who talks to one arrogant prick at Google and goes home and blogs about it, and the entire internet knows, right? And that outweighs like 50 people saying, oh yeah, I went and interviewed at Google and had fun, whatever. It doesn't take much to gain notoriety. And the other thing, beyond not wanting to have people have a bad impression of your company, candidates that you interview, you may or may not hire them, but they probably have friends who went to the same school who we may or may not want to hire. They probably buy or sell stuff on Etsy. And it just, I don't know, makes the world a better place, I think, if you can make people happier and have a good time. It's stressful, right? Like interviewing is stressful, yes, but I don't think that means that you have to piss people off. So another goal of the conversation is to answer the question, would I love to work with this person? I think this is the key thing about interviewing, is it gives you a chance to influence who you work with, and who you work with is the primary indicator of how much you like your job. So ultimately what you're trying to figure out, even if the person you're interviewing is not going to be on the same team as you, might not be in the same building as you, whatever, you may end up working with them. It's likely you will at Etsy, for sure. So answer the question, does this person have the qualities that make them somebody I would love to work with? Stuff like improving, can they contribute to the company and make it qualitatively better? Can they teach you? Can they be taught by you? Can they inspire you, et cetera, et cetera? In my ideal world, I want to be surrounded by people who are smarter than me, right? Like that, and that's why I'm here, right? Like it's great. And you want to keep raising that bar, right? Another goal of the conversation is answer the candidate's question, would you love to work at this company? In addition to answering questions they have about working at Etsy, it's also, is the culture here something you want to be a part of? And I think that was the thing that struck me the most when I interviewed here, was just how excited people were about it, kind of that idealistic piece. And yes, Nikki, that was a big part of it. But seriously, I just got a really good sense of the humanity of people who worked here during my interview, and that's super important. Kind of dovetailing in with that, good interviews are generous. And by that I mean they're honest with the candidate. They work hard for the candidate, not necessarily they expect the candidate to work for them, right? And that's being prepared, that's kind of keeping up with the candidate, that's asking good questions as the interview goes on. And when I think back on my top interviews as candidate or interviewer, I've learned something in all of them. I've learned something kind of amazing. So as an interviewer, there's the boggle question I referenced earlier. There's this, so I'll describe it briefly. You have a grid of letters, and you try to find words in those letters by picking an arbitrary letter, moving in any direction around that letter, and then doing the same thing over and over again. So it's a graph traversal problem. So that's the first part, is just traverse the graph and find all the words in it. The second part is implement a dictionary that lets you look up these words quickly. So you can use a try for that. That's the ideal solution. So that's kind of as far as I got with this question. And I asked it to a candidate, and he got through that in approximately 8 minutes. And I was like, so what else can you do? And he showed me how you could actually traverse the graph and the try in parallel by passing the try node and the graph node to your recursive function. And it was just this thing I'd never even thought of. And it's just a magical, beautiful thing. And similarly, as a candidate, when I interviewed at Google, when I interviewed at Google, one of the questions I got asked was draw a sample from a stream of unknown size, right? So you've got just this incoming data, say it's timestamps, and you want to pick 10 of them for your random sample. It turns out there's just this beautiful constant time solution to that, where you pick a random number between 0 and how many items you've seen, and if it's less than your sample size, you just put it in at that, and you can do the math to prove it. And I remember just walking out of that interview, and I was like, oh my God, that's so pretty, right? It's there's certain math problems where it just feels like you're walking on this tightrope, and it's just getting narrower and narrower, and it just converges into this beautiful thing. And that was the feeling I had in that interview. And the guy who was interviewing me was super smart and really good at hinting. I would not have got this on my own, but really good at just kind of nudging me in the right directions to get me there. So I felt like I accomplished something and I learned something. And similarly, when I interviewed here, Josh Attenberg taught me about k-means clustering, which I'd never used before, and then I knew it at the end of the interview. It was oh, this is, and again, it's this sort of beautiful math/engineering problem where it just feels good to know the solution. And all those things came from the interviewers being prepared and being knowledgeable about what they were going to ask. Kind of a counterpoint to the generosity part is time is super duper important in interviews. I think one of the main overlooked skills is time management. It's really easy to let things get away from you. You get candidates who talk too much, who want to talk about stuff that isn't necessarily germane to the conversation you're trying to have, and so on. And that is something that you can only fix with practice. All right, so I have a few thoughts on technical interviews. If you're I think these are still a little bit germane to non-technical, but whatever. So the first thing is good questions are like onions. And by that I mean there's kind of a naive solution in the outer crust, and you can peel that back and get to deeper, more interesting problems as you go on. So the first technical interview question I was ever asked at Microsoft in like 1994. I'll preface this by saying I walked in there super duper nervous, wearing a suit for probably the second time in my life. I'd never been through a technical interview before. I had no idea what I was getting myself into. Anyway, after like 5 minutes of small talk, which was the worst thing in the world, I did not want to talk about my experience or how I liked Seattle or any of that bullshit. I was not interested. After 5 minutes of hell, the interviewer asked me to write a program to draw a circle. And then it was like, all right, I can relax. I can write code. So I started out using sine and cosine. So you go 0 to 2 times pi and multiply your sine and cosine by the radius of the circle and whatever. So it was like, all right, that sucks. Speed it up. So the first optimization you can make is you realize there's 8-way symmetry in the circle, so you only need to calculate 1/8 of the circle. So you go 0 to whatever, pi over 4. And that's kind of cool, but you're still calling these math functions, which take and especially in 1994, took forever, very, very slow. So next you said, all right, you don't have sine and cosine anymore. So it's pretty easy if you just know about math to use square root instead, to solve for x based on y and r, or y based on x and r, or whatever. And you can use the symmetry still, and it's very pretty. So I wrote that. It also has the advantage of it fills in the gaps in the circles in ways the sine cosine thing doesn't. So that's nice. And it was like, all right, good job. We've got 15 minutes left. No square root. And then shit gets real, right? And it turns out there is a very pretty algorithm called Bresenham's algorithm that lets you compute the error as you move across in the x direction. You basically know how far away you are from the center based on this accumulator, and I could not derive it now, but with the right hinting in that interview, I was actually able to write it out. And at the end, with 3 minutes to go, it was like, congratulations, you just wrote the circle drawing algorithm that's used by Windows, woohoo. But what was cool is it was an hour for what seems naively like a very simple question, but it just went deeper and deeper and deeper. And as a candidate, that's great because you're kind of consumed with this question for the whole interview. It's not like a shotgun approach where it's like question A, okay, good job. Question B, okay, good job. Question C, okay, good job. It's more like you're iterating on something and achieving a goal. Other questions that are like that, the Boggle question I talked about before, another one of my favorites is Conway's Life, which is the cellular automata, basically very simple rules based on counting. You've got a big grid of cells that are on or off. For every cell on the board, you count out how many neighbors are on or off and then apply some rules to it. It's super duper simple to do the naive implementation. It's a good kind of FizzBuzz style check, like can this person actually write code? But then there are a bajillion different routes to go down to optimize it. You can make a solution that's order number of living cells. You can parallelize it. You can do all sorts of cool stuff with it. And people have been doing it for 40 years. So there's a huge body of literature about how to optimize this. Another thing is strive for higher bandwidth. And by that I mean prefer VC to phone calls, prefer in-person to VC, prefer a whiteboard and a way to draw to just talking to somebody. The more kind of paths you have for input, the better. Some people work really well on a whiteboard. Some people work really well in front of a computer. If you can give them the thing that they're most comfortable at, you're going to get more data about how they're able to solve problems. One thing that happened to me in my first Microsoft interview was I was nervous the whole day. And one of the interviewers, I think, realized this or had been talking about it or whatever, and basically just gave me a notebook and a problem and left his office and just left me alone to write code. And it was actually exactly what I needed, right? It just let me decompress. I'm not sure that that's the ideal solution, but be aware of stuff like that. Kind of parcel with that is there's an artificiality that's inevitable to an interview, right? being a candidate is not the same as actually having a job, right? It's totally obvious, but it's worth reiterating. Interviewing is a different skill than being a great engineer or whatever role you're looking for. So again, you're trying to look past the artifice and see the things that actually matter. Can this person learn? Is this person creative? Is this person enjoyable to be around? Stuff like that. And those things transcend whether you're coding on a whiteboard or coding in Emacs or whatever. And so finally, strive for more signal and less noise. That artifice introduces noise, right? And I think part of what we can do to reduce the noisiness is really let candidates know what they're in for, right? Like, there's no reason not to give candidates sample questions, let candidates practice, like encourage candidates to practice coding on a whiteboard if that's indeed what they're going to be doing in the interview. There's no reason to have an air of mystery about the interview process. It helps us if there's less noise, right? Like, I would rather get a candidate who initially was super bad at interviewing and learned to be just good enough at interviewing to pass the bar, rather than pass on that person because they didn't know what they were in for. And also make it clear to the candidate that your job as the interviewer is to help them show their best work, right? Like that's what you want to see. You're not trying to make them fail. You're trying your best to let them show their skills. So a couple things in conclusion. The way things are now, and when I think about this, because of my own bias and my history and whatever, is the kind of Google way, and I realize that Etsy is different, but I don't have enough experience to know how different. But this general milieu of like 5 or 6 interviewers in a day, an hour each, asking some questions, collating that data, that might be the best we can do. There's lots of incentives to improve, and this is kind of where we're at. Tons of companies follow this model. So it might be the best, but it probably isn't, and I hope it isn't. I think we may have reached like a local maxima, and getting to something else is very hard. I think Hacker School is a great example of something that's like way outside, that is a super effective recruiting and hiring tool, right? Like 2 months of hardcore coding, you're gonna have a really good idea of if somebody can do that and finish and so on. But I think Etsy is in a good place generally to experiment with that sort of stuff. I think because of Etsy's values and their culture, I hope that we're able to step outside that kind of what is narrow now and go bigger. Finally, my last 2 pieces of advice: have fun. It is very fun, except when it isn't, and always be learning, and don't get stale. Questions? Yes.
So you seem to be using the written feedback, and that has more signal than the numerical feedback. Have you considered trying to use some sort of text classifier or other kind of machine learning to actually extract that signal?
I never saw that happen at Google, but I have no doubt that somebody tried it. I think there was a little bit of resistance to that, simply because I think you still wanted the human input. And you wanted, and again, like in the same way that the numerical score varied by interviewer, the written feedback varied by interviewer. You had some people who were very, very nice and some who weren't, and as hiring committee, you learn that stuff. You could teach your classifier that stuff too, but you might not have enough data per interviewer to do it.
So
oh yeah, go ahead.
Well, quick other question is, I agree that the interview process doesn't really work. And I really deeply hope that our whole industry can find a better way. So I think we should keep pushing that.
Awesome. I agree. Yeah. Actually, do you want to wait for the mic? Cool.
You talked about whether it's better to pass on a candidate that would be potentially good rather than risk hiring a dud. And I was wondering, that was Google's kind of approach, because the trade-off was one way. I was wondering what your personal feeling was on that, whether it's better to take the chance on someone and potentially have to get rid of them after a while, or just deal with the person, or pass up the opportunity and miss out on somebody who could be just a poor interviewer?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm actually kind of conflicted on that because I'm pretty sure that my first job ever, they were definitely taking a chance on me. Like I asked my first boss how he did interviews as part of preparing for this. And he was like, well, Glenn came in and he knew what an interrupt was, and like in 1988, that was a really big deal. And Peter showed me the 6502 assembler game he'd written, and that was awesome. And you could type really fast, so I figured if half the stuff you wrote worked, you were set. In that aspect, I definitely think it's worth taking risks on people who might not be great interviewers or might not have kind of a classic resume or whatever. The flip side is making a bad hire isn't just bad for like one or two people, right? It has cascading effects, right? Like, do you want to, like one of the other litmus tests you think about, like, would I love to work with this person? Would I love to be carrying the pager when this person is checking in his week's worth of code, right? Like, so I think it's a balance, and there's no crisp answer for it.
And slightly related, you were talking about hiring, where avoiding isolation. So at Google, there's a hiring committee, whereas at Microsoft, you would have a team that was interviewing, or a group that was interviewing somebody for that specific team. And so from what I understand, what you explained was, at Google, they were hiring for the company, not for the specific person, for the team, whereas at Microsoft, it was for the team.
Right.
And at Microsoft, they were very explicit about you were not allowed to hire somebody, but not say, you could not say, I'll hire them, but not for my team. And I was wondering if, when you're hiring by committee, whether there's always this risk that you go, well, they're good enough for Google, but they wouldn't be good enough for my team.
Right.
And how do you avoid that?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. I think a couple of times that came up in like hiring committees written basically every member of hiring committee would write feedback on the feedback for the candidate, and a couple of times that came up, and it was very quickly shot down. It's like, if you don't think this person's good enough for your own team, then we're not going to hire them. And I think like that was just a cultural thing. And I think like, again, there's no hard and fast rules, but the culture was such that you knew you were hiring for Google and for somebody who could, because you don't even know what team they're going to end up on in hiring committee, right? Like the allocation process is completely separate, so they might very well end up on your team.
What do you do for teams that are specialized? Like, let's say the seller economics team or the search team, where there's domain knowledge that's required. So you might have someone who has a strong PHP background, but not a strong Java background. So it's very obvious where they would not fit in.
Right, so the question is, how do you hire for domain-specific teams? The idea for that is they meet the minimum bar, and then on top of that, they have domain knowledge.
So they would have 2 interview processes for that?
No, you'd probably have one person on the interview loop who tested the specific domain knowledge, and then the rest would just be normal interviews. Yeah.
Sometimes I'm torn between whether to sort of focus more on like a personality fit, especially at a company like Etsy, versus kind of, like, because you can get candidates where you're sort of like, does this person have really strong technical skills, or do they have like okay technical skills but like a really good personality fit? Like, where do you fall on that?
So I think if it's technical, like if it's specific technical skills versus personality, I would go more towards personality, but I also want to see the ability to learn and pick stuff up, right? Like if we're hiring somebody at Etsy who doesn't know PHP, but like has demonstrated expertise in like JavaScript or Java or whatever, like that's fine because they can pick those things up. If you're talking about somebody who you don't think is going to be able to get to the level of expertise that we need, then I would think that would trump. You need both, right? Like, you can't be weak personality-wise and strong technically, or weak technically and strong personality-wise. Like, I think at Etsy, it's super duper important to have both.
So, follow up to that question. There's a saying that's been blogged about and stuff that you don't hire. Okay. Don't hire assholes, like even if they're brilliant and perfect for the job. And I'm kind of wondering what your thoughts on that policy is.
I could not agree more with that. It's actually funny. I interviewed somebody at Google who worked at ATI or something. He was like this domain expert in CUDA, the parallel processing for GPUs. And he was just a straight up asshole to me during the interview. And he was incredibly smart too, right? But so in my feedback I wrote like, dude was incredibly smart and dude was a dick. And it turned out I was in hiring committee when his packet came through, and somebody else who was on hiring committee had previously worked with him at ATI and was like, oh, this guy's a dick. It was like, so it creates a toxic environment when you're working with assholes. Like, it makes you not want to go to work. And I don't care how smart they are, it drags everybody down. Yeah.
I had a question about talking between interviews. There's some places that encourage people not to talk between interviews so that everyone has a clean sheet and is not biased going into the interviews.
Yeah.
Whereas other places encourage you to talk between interviews so that if somebody struggles on a specific area, you can go and see whether they were nervous and give them another opportunity to prove themselves. I was wondering which way you kind of lean and what your experience is with, if you've had both or what.
Yeah, so that's a great contrast between Microsoft and Google. Again, Microsoft, there was an email chain going on in the background as the interview loop went on. And basically, as soon as you were done with your interview, you send out mail that said hire or no hire for these reasons. So the next, not the next interviewer, but the interviewer after the next would see that loop and kind of have that. And partly it was used to be like, oh, I'm not quite sure they were good at X. You should test further on that, and that was a good thing about it. The bad thing that happened a lot was the very first interviewer would be pretty senior, or pretty respected, or whatever, and he'd send out this mail, and then people later on wouldn't want to disagree with him. So you'd kind of like get poisoned or blessed by your first interview. So it introduced or amplified a lot of bias. So Google explicitly forbade you from talking to other people on the loop until you'd submitted your written feedback. And at that point, you could talk about the candidate all you wanted, like within the bounds of respect and so on. And that was, so it was hard to have context, right? It was nice because everybody started with a clean slate, but you didn't necessarily know all that much about what happened before. The way around that is there's just a little sheet of paper in the interview room that everybody would write down what question they asked and if they thought there was a particular place to go deeper on. And that worked pretty well. I think like I would much rather have that without the bias and maybe lose some stuff than introducing the bias.
I was just wondering if you had any experience or opinions on group interviews, say 2 interviewers and 1 candidate.
Yeah, that's, so I don't have any so at Google, when you were done with interview training, you basically had 2 shadow interviews and then 1 interview where you were shadowed by somebody more experienced. And the deal with those is the shadower would be quiet, right? Like part of the contract as a shadower was you just sat there and observed and didn't say a word. I think that's reasonable. It's a good way for people to kind of see what's going on. My concern about having 2 interviewers and 1 candidate is the candidate could feel ganged up on, that sort of stuff. But I also think there's plenty of room for it if you're aware of that dynamic and can kind of damp that and mitigate that.
Bill Massey, I take over from you. My question, I'm on the recruiting team, and my question, having seen our process and gone through our process yourself, if you had the power to change 1 or 2 things about it as a start, what would you change? Yeah,
so I was surprised in my interview by how little coding I got asked. I'm not sure like why that was, but it was a little surprising to me. That's like, in terms of like tweaks, that's the only thing I can think of. But yeah, but I will say, I was super impressed with the SE interview process as a whole because it really seemed to value the fact that I was a person, and there was a lot of emphasis placed on like, could you communicate? Like, could you hang out and just talk? Which is a super important thing, right? So that made me super happy and was actually a big part of the reason I came here. So, yeah.
So you mentioned that at Google sometimes they would have like throw in newbies, but they always had 3 experienced, or what do you say?
Yeah,
calibrated.
Yeah, calibrated,
right?
exactly.
In case they needed to throw out the newbies, like what would determine whether you needed to throw out the newbies feedback or not?
I mean, throwing out is a strong word. Like, it would still be in the packet. It's just how much weight hiring committee would give to them, right? Like, basically what you're looking for is, do you have enough data to hire somebody you should hire, right? So if you've got 3 calibrated interviews where they've written really good feedback and they've asked good questions, that's enough. And if 2 of them, they might still give good scores, but they're just thin on details and stuff like that, you can still get that packet through. So it's not like you just take them out and don't factor them into the score generally, although that can happen for extreme cases. It's more like it's just, you just don't place as much weight on them.
So what does data look like? Like, what would a good newbie's feedback or packet look like?
That's actually a fantastic question. So what you'd want to see on hiring committee is you'd want to see good questions, right? Like, you'd want to see some questions that exercise a candidate's algorithmic and coding skills. If they're more senior, you want to see some design questions. You want to see good detailed feedback written up. You want to see, like, here's, like, not a narrative flow per se, but like, here are the various ways that the candidate attacked the problem. Here's where I had to hint. Here's where I didn't have to hint, where maybe I had to hint in other places. Here's how this candidate did kind of compared to, like, how I would think a Googler would do on this question, that sort of stuff. And then just a good solid opinion that kind of falls out of those facts, right? Like, this person, had a very good grasp of graph traversal, was able to apply that to this question that wasn't, like, at a surface about graph traversal, wrote solid code, talked through, like, told me when these variables were poorly named because he didn't want to write them out on the whiteboard, et cetera, right? And because of all those things, I think we should hire them. Yeah.
Hi, I'm sorry if I missed this, but I had interviewed with Google and they told me exactly what they were going to do, like with the written stuff and whatever. But I still don't really know what Etsy does after they interview with the. Did we go over that, or did I miss? Or
I didn't go over that because I've only been a part of that once, and it was on my very first day here.
So do people meet and talk, or do they write stuff up, or what do we actually do?
Do you want to answer? Sure.
Well, I'll answer, but you can help me out if I get it wrong. But usually there's a pre-huddle before the interview where everybody gets in a room, talks about who's going to focus on what, like particularly technical stuff. Then the interviews happen, and then there's a post-huddle where people talk about their impressions, and that's after you've already submitted your stuff to JobVite, like to avoid that information cascade sort of thing that Moishe was talking about. So in that post-huddle, people are pretty much talking about their impressions and that sort of thing.
And then who makes the final decision?
Usually the hiring manager.
Well, the final decision gets made by Kellen or Mark.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We have a final interview about
That's true. It gets approved after that.
Yeah.
You mentioned that after an interview at Google, you would write 2 or 3 pages. Is that 2 or 3 full pages? Just because I know on the JobVite, the box is about 4 lines long, and you can write maybe 1 paragraph before it starts to overflow. So I'm wondering if, 1, we should make that bigger, or 2, it was an exaggeration.
It actually was not. I mean, so half of that is probably taken up with code samples. But like, if you were to print it out double-spaced, it would probably, I think 2 pages would be pretty typical for feedback. As far as the JobVite thing goes, I think if everybody who goes to the wrap-up meeting actually talked to the candidate, then you could think of that field as more notes for what you're going to bring up during the wrap-up. So it probably doesn't need to be as verbose. Like, in hiring committee, we had literally 0 context outside of that feedback. So it needed to be more wordy. It might be, yeah. I mean, I am an advocate of more data, more persistence, like writing more up. I think is worthwhile. Any, yeah.
So part of the interview process is what you said, convincing the candidate that they want to come to this company as well. And I was wondering if at Google or Microsoft, and I actually don't know if this is true at Etsy, is there a feedback of people who turn us down or turn those jobs down to come back and to like reevaluate if things could have changed in the interview process or something turned them off? Or
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that Google does follow-ups with candidates who don't get the job. For two reasons. One is like a lot of them, Google wants to get back in a year to re-interview, so just kind of keeping that communication open, but also just feedback on the hiring process. And I will say that it got much better over the time I was there. Like when I first joined, like one of the big things was it took months to get a decision, like literally months. And now like it tends to be a couple of weeks, so, which is still not great. Okay, yeah, go.
Sorry, I feel like I have a million questions here.
Sorry.
I wanted to ask you about hints and whether or not that just comes from practice. Like if you give open-ended questions, like asking an interviewee, for example, to explain what happens in a web request, and you're expecting them to go like dive deeper and deeper and deeper, and they really stumble early on and don't know where to go, or if you give them like a coding question and they get stuck. Like, as I ask the questions more often, it becomes easier to give hints, but I was wondering if there's like techniques that one can use to give hints without actually giving the explicit answer away.
Right. I mean, I think part of it is having questions that lend themselves to hints, right? Like, don't have questions with a yes or no answer or a vocab question with a definition, right? Like that. So right off the bat, that's one thing. I think, you know, as you said, just the more you ask the question, the more you know how to hint about it. So that's, I think a lot of it just comes down to practice. And like the more practice you have with questions in general, the more you'll be able to hint at a specific question that might be new to you. Yeah.
In the last organization that I worked for, I got to contribute to, we developed our interview process and would always add in a question that was deliberately intended to combat that problem. So something like, tell me about the most hilarious prank you were recently involved in, or tell me what your midnight snack is, because those are the moments that we could really capture someone's personality fit.
Yeah.
Was there a Google and or Microsoft equivalent to that, or something that fits in the coding/engineer universe that gets to those kinds of points?
I don't think there was something like that at Google or Microsoft, but the first question I was asked here by Josh was, what's your favorite algorithm? Which I think is a phenomenal question. Like in terms of culture fit, like do you have one, right? And then like in terms of technical ability, can you describe it, right? So I think, and that's a neat, like, people don't really practice for that. Like I think a big problem with some of these behavioral questions, like what do you do when X happens, is people read books and prepare for exactly that thing. So it's tough to combat that. But I agree with the general idea. Any questions from remotes? Anybody on IRC here? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Oh, here.
There's been some books on this subject because books make money. Have you read any of them? Can you recommend any of them? Are they all bad?
So I started reading Programming Interviews Exposed, and one of the questions in that book was the draw a circle one that I talked about. And they didn't even get to the interesting shit. Like it was just like, here's the simple square root solution. And I read that and I was like, all right, this book sucks. It might not, but like their treatment of that question sure did. Somebody I worked with at Google, Gail Lockman, wrote this book called Programming, actually I don't even know what it's called, but anyway, I trust her. She's super duper smart, and she's put a lot of time into this, and she was on hiring committee at Google, so I suspect that's probably a very good book. And again, like, anything that can kind of reduce the noise for candidates coming in, I think is a good thing. So if they have some idea of what's coming in a technical interview, that helps. It helps both parties.
Question from remote. What's your opinion on turnaround time after the interview for an offer?
Turnaround time for, like how quickly should we get back to a candidate?
Right, I think that's what they're asking.
I mean, I want to say the sooner the better. But the problem is that that implies kind of one failure point, right? Like at Microsoft, I got an offer the day that I interviewed because my last interview was the hiring manager. But and that's fine if you have a lot of trust in all those hiring managers. As soon as you go to a committee, then it introduces, by necessity, more lag. Arguably, you get better results from that. So it's just a balancing act. And as a candidate, you obviously want to hear as soon as possible. There's nothing worse than waiting around to hear. And like when I interviewed at Google in April and got an offer at the end of June. And it was just like every week the recruiter would call me and be like, hey, your packet's at such and such hiring committee, or hey, and it drove me nuts. Yeah, the sooner the better for your process. Cool. All right, well, thanks so much. This is fun.